It was the kind of car that shouldn't have existed. Nobody knew where it came from, and nobody could explain how it was still on the road. It sat at the edge of an old junkyard, covered in a layer of grime so thick that it almost looked like a shadow. Its black paint was dull, almost matte, and every inch of it seemed to swallow light rather than reflect it. People called it the Phantom, but not many dared to approach it, let alone touch it. For the longest time it sat there, a silent relic of a past no one could trace. But then, one evening, Jake spotted it while heading home from work. He had been struggling to make ends meet and was desperate for a car, any car, that could get him through his daily commute. His old clunker had finally given up, and the bus schedule was a nightmare. So when Jake saw that haunting silhouette through the chain-link fence of the junkyard, something pulled him in. He asked around, but nobody claimed ownership of the car. The junkyard workers said it had been there for as long as they could remember, and it didn't even seem to belong to the yard. One of the mechanics mentioned, almost in a whisper, that people who tried to take it out didn't return. Jake laughed it off, attributing it to small-town superstition. It was, after all, just a car, an old beat-up thing with no owner. He had been to the junkyard before, and the manager had a way of getting rid of cars dirt cheap. A few days later, Jake walked in with a wad of cash and walked out with the keys to the Phantom. From the moment Jake turned the key in the ignition, something felt wrong. The engine roared to life, strong, unnervingly smooth for a car of its age. But as he sat in the driver's seat, he swore the steering wheel felt warm. Not the kind of warmth from a car baking in the sun, but something different, like a pulse beneath the surface. He brushed it off as his imagination and pulled out of the junkyard. At first, the Phantom was perfect. Jake marveled at how it seemed to glide across the roads. The brakes were responsive, the engine purred like new, and there wasn't a single sign of mechanical trouble. It was as if the car had been waiting for someone to drive it. But things started to change by the end of the first week. Jake began to notice the radio, though it didn't seem to work, at least not properly. No matter what station he turned it to, it would only play one thing, a soft, crackling static, like whispers just beyond comprehension. When he tried to turn it off, it would flicker back on by itself. He started hearing faint voices, as if someone was speaking directly into his ear, but when he checked the passenger seat, there was nothing but the cold air beside him. Then came the dreams. Every night Jake would dream that he was driving on a long, empty road. The car's headlights barely pierced the thick fog, and in the distance, shadowy figures would appear on the roadside, watching him. Sometimes they stood still, but other times they would lurch forward, reaching for the car as if trying to drag him out. He would always wake up in a cold sweat, his heart racing, but each time he woke, he would find the car parked outside his apartment building. No matter where he left it, it would be there, almost waiting for him. The final straw came one night after a particularly haunting dream, where he crashed into one of the shadowy figures. In the dream, he remembered hearing a loud thump, followed by the sound of something scraping along the underside of the car. When he woke, he felt a jolt of nausea as he looked at the front bumper. There was fresh blood smeared across the grille. Horrified, Jake rushed to check the streets around his apartment. He hadn't left his place that night. Had he? That evening, determined to figure out what was happening, Jake searched the car. In the glove compartment, he found an old, yellowed newspaper clipping, crumpled and stained with age. The headline chilled him to the bone: "Driver killed in hit and run, body never recovered." According to the article, the car had been involved in a fatal accident nearly 30 years ago. The driver, a man named Richard Hale, had run someone over and fled the scene. The article mentioned how Hale had gone missing soon after, vanished without a trace. His car, the same Phantom that Jake now owned, had been found abandoned days later at the side of a rural road, but no sign of Hale was ever discovered. Jake's hands trembled as he dropped the clipping. It couldn't be a coincidence. But as he started to piece the puzzle together, the engine of the car suddenly roared to life on its own. The headlights flickered on, casting an eerie glow across the room. Jake backed away, but before he could react, the car's doors slammed shut, trapping him inside. The radio hissed to life, the static growing louder, turning into the unmistakable sound of someone breathing, someone sitting right beside him. He gripped the steering wheel, frantically trying to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. The car started to move, backing out of the driveway with a mind of its own. Jake's foot wasn't on the pedal. The steering wheel turned by itself, guiding the car down darkened streets, deeper into the outskirts of town. The whispering grew louder now, echoing inside Jake's head. Drive, finish what he started. Jake fought against the wheel, but it was no use. The car had taken control. It barreled down a back road that Jake had never driven before, and in the distance, through the fog, he saw it, a figure standing motionless in the center of the road. Panic surged through his veins. The car wasn't stopping. He screamed, pulling at the wheel, slamming his foot on the brake, but nothing worked. The figure grew larger and larger until Jake could make out its face, pale, hollow, eyes wide with terror. And just as he braced for the impact, the figure disappeared beneath the car. The sound that followed was a horrible screeching, metal grinding against bone. The car screeched to a halt. Jake sat frozen in his seat, his knuckles white from gripping the wheel. Slowly he turned his head toward the passenger seat. Sitting next to him was the ghostly figure of the man he had run over in his dreams, the same figure Richard Hale had left to die. The last thing Jake felt was cold fingers wrapping around his throat. The next morning, the Phantom was found abandoned on the side of the road, its doors wide open. Jake was gone, vanished, just like Richard Hale. The car, however, remained, waiting for its next driver.